It's September 29th, 1982. A crisp autumn morning in Chicago. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman wakes up with a sore throat. Her parents hand her an extra-strength Tylenol capsule. Just one pill, the most trusted pain reliever in America. By 7 a.m., she collapses on the bathroom floor, unresponsive. Doctors try everything, but within hours, she is gone. No one yet realizes it. But this is only the beginning of a wave of sudden, unexplained deaths that will paralyze an entire nation. What should have been relief from pain has become a weapon of murder. And before we dive in, a quick reminder. Over 90% of people watching my videos aren't subscribed. If you enjoy true crime mysteries like this one, subscribing helps this channel grow and ensures you never miss the next upload. Now, let's step back into Chicago, 1982. Mary Kellerman's death seemed, at first, like a tragic medical mystery. But within hours, tragedy struck again. Adam Janis, a 27-year-old postal worker from the nearby suburb of Arlington Heights, stayed home from work that day, not feeling well. He too reached for Tylenol, swallowing 2 capsules to ease his discomfort. He collapsed shortly after and was rushed to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Doctors initially believed it might be a heart attack or some sudden undiagnosed condition. But as the Janis family gathered at their home to mourn, heartbreak turned into horror. Adam's younger brother, Stanley, and Stanley's wife, Teresa, both complained of headaches from the stress of the day. They each took Tylenol from the same bottle Adam had used. Within hours, both of them were dead. 3 lives gone in one family in less than 24 hours. The shocking pattern was undeniable. A trusted household medicine was now leaving bodies in its wake. Soon, other victims would follow. Mary Reiner, a 27-year-old new mother who had just given birth days earlier, took Tylenol for postpartum discomfort. She collapsed and died, leaving behind a newborn. Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant, purchased a bottle of Tylenol at a Chicago pharmacy after a long shift. She was found dead in her apartment the next morning, the open bottle on her bathroom counter. By the end of that week, 7 people were dead. 7 ordinary lives cut short, all connected by a single brand of pain reliever. The city of Chicago fell into chaos. Hospitals began receiving waves of terrified residents, worried that they too might be poisoned. Shelves across the city were cleared of Tylenol. Parents threw away medicine bottles. News outlets spread warnings like wildfire. Do not take Tylenol. It may be deadly. For decades, Tylenol had been a symbol of trust, found in medicine cabinets in nearly every home. Now, it was the face of fear. Police and federal agents were scrambled. Investigators rushed to analyze the suspicious bottles. What they found chilled them to the core. The capsules had been laced with potassium cyanide. A lethal dose, strong enough to kill within minutes. There was no question anymore. This wasn't a manufacturing error. This was intentional. Someone had turned Tylenol, America's #1 pain reliever, into a weapon of murder. Imagine the atmosphere in Chicago at that moment. People were afraid to take anything, not just Tylenol. Aspirin, cold medicine, even food and drink. Fear seeped into every home. As panic gripped Chicago, the investigation became a race against time. Detectives fanned out across neighborhoods, visiting every store where Tylenol had been sold. Officers carried boxes out of drugstores, supermarkets, and corner pharmacies. Customers watched in disbelief as trusted medicine was treated like contraband. Entire shelves stood empty, leaving behind nothing but fear and unanswered questions. Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical giant behind Tylenol, was thrown into crisis mode. Their flagship product, the one that brought in hundreds of millions each year, had become the most feared substance in America. Executives rushed into emergency meetings. Should they recall every bottle of Tylenol in the country? Could they afford not to? In a move that shocked the corporate world, Johnson & Johnson issued a nationwide recall. 31 million bottles pulled from shelves at an estimated cost of more than $100 million. It was unprecedented. No company had ever taken such a drastic step. But this wasn't about profit anymore. It was about survival, both for the brand and for public trust. Still, the recall could not erase the horror already inflicted. In living rooms and hospitals across Chicago, grief was overwhelming. Parents held on to photographs of their lost children. Husbands and wives buried their spouses, left with nothing but confusion and rage. Who would poison random bottles of Tylenol? Why target innocent families? And how could anyone stop a killer who seemed invisible? The randomness was the most chilling part. Unlike serial killers who stalked specific victims, this murderer didn't need to know his targets. Anyone who bought a bottle could fall. A mother, a child, a newlywed, a retiree. All it took was one capsule. That uncertainty spread like wildfire, infecting the city with paranoia. Grocery trips became terrifying. People refused to take even vitamins, convinced that nothing was safe. Strangers eyed one another suspiciously in pharmacies, wondering if the person next to them might be the poisoner returning bottles to the shelves. Investigators worked around the clock. Laboratories tested capsules, looking for traces of cyanide. Each discovery was the same. Lethal doses, carefully placed, indistinguishable from safe ones until it was too late. Detectives pored over security footage from pharmacies, but the grainy black and white tapes offered no clear suspects. Witnesses recalled seeing shoppers come and go, but no one noticed anything unusual. The killer had been precise, calculated, and above all, ordinary enough to blend in completely. As law enforcement scrambled, another storm brewed. The media. Every headline screamed catastrophe. Every news anchor delivered updates with urgency. The nation was watching Chicago like a city under siege. And with each passing day, pressure mounted on investigators to deliver answers. But there were no easy answers. The killer left no notes, no demands. It wasn't robbery. It wasn't personal revenge, at least not in any obvious way. It was an act of pure disruption, chaos introduced into the most mundane part of daily life, swallowing a pill for relief. Experts began to speculate publicly. Some believed this was terrorism, meant to send a message through fear. Others suggested corporate sabotage, a rival company out to destroy Johnson & Johnson's reputation. A darker theory emerged, too, that the killer might simply be a sadist, finding pleasure in the idea that ordinary families were dying from an act so small, so ordinary, that no one could have predicted it. In the homes of the victims, grief hardened into anger. The Janus family had lost 3 loved ones in one day: Adam, Stanley, and Teresa. Neighbors brought casseroles and condolences, but what comfort could words bring when the cause was so senseless? For the Kellermans, Mary's death was an unimaginable blow. A child, lost in an instant, from a pill her parents had trusted to make her better. Chicago's medical examiners provided grim confirmation. Cyanide poisoning was unmistakable once detected. It cut off the body's ability to use oxygen, suffocating cells from the inside out. Death came quickly, often within minutes, leaving victims gasping, seizing, collapsing before help could arrive. There was no antidote, no chance to fight back. For those who had swallowed the poison capsules, the outcome was inevitable. And as the investigation widened, the question loomed: how many more bottles were out there? Were there poisoned capsules in other states, other cities, other homes? Could the killer strike again? The FBI coordinated with police departments across the country, urging citizens to throw away any Tylenol capsules immediately. Pharmacies offered refunds. Johnson & Johnson opened hotlines. But the sense of dread lingered. This wasn't like a fire you could put out. This was a ghost hiding in plain sight, inside millions of identical white bottles with red caps. Behind the scenes, a task force formed. Dozens of detectives, scientists, and federal agents worked side by side, searching for patterns. Were the poisoned bottles from the same batch? Were they all sold in the same area? Slowly, a map emerged. Most of the tainted bottles were traced back to the Chicago metropolitan area. That meant the killer was likely local, moving from store to store, slipping cyanide into capsules unnoticed. It was terrifyingly simple and devastatingly effective. For Chicagoans, daily life changed overnight. Pharmacies became guarded places. Police officers patrolled aisles. Ordinary errands were done with suspicion and fear. Parents locked medicine cabinets. Families whispered rumors. What if milk was next? What if baby formula was poisoned? If Tylenol wasn't safe, then nothing was safe. The chilling truth was clear. The killer had struck at the very heart of trust. Medicine wasn't supposed to kill, but now it did. And as the body count grew, one horrifying thought gripped the entire nation. The killer might still be out there, watching the panic unfold and smiling. As the days stretched into weeks, frustration deepened. Investigators had leads, but no breakthroughs. Dozens of interviews yielded little. No one recalled seeing anyone tamper with bottles. No store employees noticed anything unusual. It was as though the killer had walked in, committed the crime in plain sight, and vanished like smoke. The FBI began treating the case as a matter of national security. Tampering with consumer goods wasn't just murder. It was an attack on the fabric of American life. If one person could terrorize millions with a handful of capsules, what was to stop others from doing the same? Officials feared copycats, and those fears weren't unfounded. Within weeks, reports of suspected tampering popped up in other cities. Most turned out to be hoaxes, but they drained resources and inflamed public paranoia. Every suspicious bottle, every strange taste in medicine, sparked a new wave of panic. Johnson & Johnson, desperate to save both lives and their reputation, took bold action. They didn't just recall Tylenol. They reinvented it. The company introduced tamper-evident packaging, triple-sealed bottles with foil lids, glued boxes, and plastic wrap. These changes, now standard in nearly every household product, were born out of this nightmare. It was damage control, yes, but also innovation forged in tragedy. The Tylenol murders permanently changed the way the world thought about safety. Still, these corporate measures did little to comfort grieving families. At funerals across Chicago, the same haunting questions lingered. Why us? Why them? Why anyone? For detectives, the inability to provide answers was crushing. The case remained open, but progress was slow. They had no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no surveillance that showed anything useful. Just bottles, capsules, and cyanide. The Tylenol murders permanently changed the way the world thought about safety. Every time someone twisted open a bottle, they thought about Chicago in 1982. And yet, the mystery endures. Who poisoned those capsules? Was it a lone wolf, an opportunist who vanished into the night? Was it someone close to the victims, driven by a personal vendetta? Or was it an act of terror deliberately designed to strike fear into an entire nation? 40 years later, those questions remain unanswered. Investigators had little to go on besides the bottles themselves. Forensic science in 1982 was primitive compared to today. There was no DNA profiling, no advanced chemical tracking, no nationwide surveillance networks. Detectives relied on fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, and chemical analysis. But when it came to the poison capsules, fingerprints were either smudged, missing, or belonged to store employees and customers with no connection to the crime. Detectives began retracing every step of the victim's final hours. They visited the grocery stores, drugstores, and corner pharmacies where the fatal bottles had been purchased. They spoke with clerks, managers, and shoppers. Did anyone recall a suspicious figure? Someone lingering near the medicine aisle? Someone returning bottles? The answers were frustratingly vague. One cashier thought she'd seen a man buying Tylenol alone late at night. Another remembered a customer who seemed nervous. But none of it was definitive. The trail was already cold. Meanwhile, the laboratories delivered grim consistency. The capsules weren't poisoned at the factory. They were tampered with later, after distribution, at the retail level. That meant the killer had gone into stores, opened bottles, filled certain capsules with cyanide, resealed them, and placed them back on the shelves. The audacity of it was staggering. The randomness was terrifying. And the simplicity was almost insulting. No master plan, no elaborate device. Just a bottle, a capsule, and a killer who knew how to disappear. The media frenzy only intensified the chaos. Reporters swarmed press conferences, demanding updates, pressing police chiefs for answers. Each day without progress was a headline of failure. Chicago became ground zero for fear, and the rest of the country followed. Stores yanked Tylenol from shelves nationwide. Competitors rushed to assure customers that their own products were safe. But the damage was done. Trust in consumer safety had been shattered. At the center of it all was Johnson & Johnson. For the company, this was not just a business crisis. It was an existential one. Their brand was synonymous with safety, with family, with trust. And now, their product was being linked to mass murder. Yet, rather than retreat, Johnson & Johnson leaned into transparency. They opened phone lines for the public, held daily press briefings, and offered free replacements for returned Tylenol. More importantly, they made the historic decision to introduce tamper-evident packaging, plastic seals, glued boxes, foil linings, protections the public had never seen before. The company gambled everything on the hope that consumers would one day feel safe again. For detectives, though, corporate solutions weren't enough. They needed a face, a name, a suspect, and soon, they thought they might have one. An anonymous letter arrived, addressed to Johnson & Johnson. Its message was chilling but strangely opportunistic. The writer claimed responsibility for the Tylenol deaths and demanded $1 million to stop. If the company complied, the killings would end. If not, the deaths would continue. The letter was turned over to the FBI, who quickly suspected it wasn't written by the actual killer, but by someone trying to cash in on the terror. Still, the letter gave them their first tangible lead. The author had left behind details, phrases, handwriting, a return address. Investigators traced the extortion attempt to James Lewis, a man living in New York with a history of fraud, theft, and deception. Lewis was no stranger to law enforcement. He had been connected to check fraud schemes, false identities, and suspicious financial dealings. He fit the profile of a conman, but not necessarily a poisoner. Still, the FBI pounced. They raided his home, combed through his belongings, and interrogated him for hours. Lewis admitted writing the letter, but insisted he had nothing to do with the actual murders. He claimed he'd only wanted to exploit the situation to get money. To investigators, Lewis was a maddening figure. He was intelligent, articulate, and evasive. He played cat and mouse with agents, answering questions with questions, smiling as though he enjoyed the attention. Was he just a clever opportunist? Or was he the killer himself, hiding behind the convenient excuse of extortion? Prosecutors couldn't prove murder, but they could prove extortion. James Lewis was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He would serve just over a decade before being released. And while his conviction brought some satisfaction, it left the bigger question unanswered. If Lewis wasn't the Tylenol killer, then who was? The investigation pressed on, chasing every lead, no matter how thin. Detectives considered disgruntled employees at Johnson & Johnson, rival pharmaceutical companies, even domestic terrorists. Each theory generated interest, but none produced evidence strong enough to stick. The killer had been too careful, too quiet, too ordinary. And in the background, the families of the victims endured their grief in silence. They watched as their loved ones' names became headlines, then faded into history. They sat through press conferences and interviews, clinging to hope that one day, someone would be held accountable. But year after year, the silence only deepened. By the end of 1982, the Tylenol Task Force had interviewed hundreds of people, tested thousands of capsules, and spent countless hours chasing shadows. Yet they were no closer to solving the case than they had been on day one. The Tylenol murders had become one of the most haunting cold cases in American history. And yet, behind closed doors, investigators whispered about another possibility. What if James Lewis hadn't acted alone? What if the Tylenol murders weren't the work of a single madman, but part of a larger, more complex plan, one that had gone undetected for decades? The arrest of James Lewis might have been a brief moment of victory for law enforcement, but behind the scenes, it raised more questions than answers. For all his criminal tendencies, Lewis didn't seem to fit the profile of someone who could calmly walk into stores, lace capsules with cyanide, and leave undetected. He was a scam artist, not a silent killer. But in the absence of stronger suspects, the FBI kept him in the spotlight. As Lewis sat behind bars, agents widened the net. They scoured Chicago for anyone who had purchased Tylenol in bulk, anyone who had connections to chemical suppliers, anyone with a personal grudge against Johnson & Johnson. They even looked into pharmacists, since they would have had easy access to bottles and capsules. But time and again, the leads fizzled out. Witnesses remembered nothing useful. Surveillance cameras were rare in 1982, and those that existed provided blurry, unusable images. The limitations of the era loomed large. Today, investigators would have DNA samples from the bottles, fingerprints enhanced with digital imaging, and retail security footage from every angle. Back then, none of those tools existed. The killer had struck in a window of history when slipping into the shadows was all too easy. Still, police had to try. They visited laboratories across Illinois, checking purchase records for cyanide. Cyanide wasn't something you could just pick up at a corner store, but it was available to chemists, jewelry manufacturers, even photographers. Dozens of companies used it legitimately. that left investigators with an overwhelming pool of possibilities. Every chemical supplier became a potential source. Every customer became a potential suspect. But again, the search yielded nothing concrete. The public, meanwhile, demanded answers. Fear was transforming into frustration, and frustration into anger. In Chicago, parents checked every pill before giving it to their children. People threw away not just Tylenol, but all over-the-counter medicine. The shelves in pharmacies looked stripped bare, as though a storm had hit. Competitors like Advil and Motrin were suddenly in demand, but even they weren't trusted. If Tylenol could be poisoned, why not everything else? Talk shows and newspapers speculated wildly. Some said it was a terrorist plot. Others believed it was the work of a serial killer testing his methods. Still others thought it might have been a disgruntled worker inside Johnson & Johnson. Theories multiplied, each one more sensational than the last, feeding public paranoia. The FBI even entertained the idea that the killer wanted to watch the chaos unfold. Perhaps he was sitting at home, reading every headline, smiling as families panicked and corporations scrambled. The randomness of the attacks suggested someone who craved fear, not money. Someone who wanted to disrupt everyday life, to show how fragile the illusion of safety really was. In this climate of dread, copycats began to emerge. Reports surfaced of other products being tampered with: Excedrin, Sudafed, even baby food. Most turned out to be false alarms or isolated hoaxes. But each report forced authorities to react as though it were real, draining resources and compounding the sense of helplessness. The Tylenol scare had unleashed a cultural panic that stretched far beyond Chicago. And then, in the midst of all this, another strange figure entered the spotlight. A man named Roger Arnold, a 48-year-old dock worker, suddenly found himself accused by rumor and suspicion. Arnold had been known to buy chemicals for home experiments. He'd made statements about the Tylenol case in local bars, drawing unwanted attention. Soon, whispers spread, was Arnold the poisoner? Police investigated him thoroughly. They searched his home, interviewed his acquaintances, and dug into his past. What they found was concerning but inconclusive. Arnold did indeed have cyanide in his possession, but it was for legitimate purposes tied to his tinkering with metals. He had no clear link to the bottles, no evidence tying him directly to the murders. Still, the public wasn't convinced. Arnold's name circulated in the press, and his life unraveled under the weight of suspicion. He became paranoid, convinced that everyone around him thought he was guilty. That paranoia would eventually lead Arnold down a dark path of his own, a tragic side story in the larger Tylenol saga that would unfold in later years. For now, though, Arnold was released. Another suspect ruled out. Another dead end. As weeks turned into months, frustration seeped into the task force. Agents worked 12-hour days, poring over documents, rechecking interviews, retesting capsules. They felt the weight of history pressing down on them. This was no longer just a case. It was a crisis of public confidence. If they failed, it would mean admitting that someone could commit mass murder with over-the-counter medicine and get away with it. Behind the scenes, though, investigators weren't just chasing suspects. They were learning lessons. They began pushing for new regulations, new safeguards. What if every medicine bottle had to be sealed in a way that made tampering obvious? What if packaging itself became the first line of defense? It was a revolutionary idea at the time, born out of desperation. The Tylenol murders, though unsolved, were about to change consumer safety forever. But for the families of the victims, none of that mattered. They wanted justice. They wanted answers. And they were about to be disappointed again, because by the end of 1983, the Tylenol task force had exhausted nearly every lead. But in the back of everyone's mind lingered a chilling thought. The Tylenol killer could still be out there. He could walk past you in a grocery store. He could be your neighbor, your coworker, even a stranger sitting quietly at a cafe. Whoever he was, he had gotten away with one of the most terrifying acts of domestic terror in American history, and that silence was almost more frightening than the crime itself. And then, years later, new science would give investigators reason to hope again. DNA, modern forensics, and an old suspect whose name still lingered in the files, James Lewis. By the mid-1980s, the Tylenol case had gone cold. No new deaths, no new evidence, and no killer behind bars. For most people, the fear eventually faded. Life returned to normal, The shelves restocked, and the tragedy receded into memory. But for the victims' families, the wounds never healed. They lived with the gnawing reality that the person responsible had walked away, free and unseen. And yet, the shadow of the murders lingered in strange and unexpected ways. For some, suspicion never died. One name in particular continued to haunt investigators: Roger Arnold, the dock worker who had briefly been under scrutiny. Arnold couldn't escape the whispers. His coworkers looked at him differently, neighbors gossiped, and his name became tied to the most infamous case in Chicago. The stress and paranoia consumed him. He lost his job, withdrew from society, and became convinced that everyone thought he was guilty. His life unraveled, and in a tragic twist, the suspicion turned deadly. In 1983, Arnold confronted a man he believed was spreading rumors about his involvement in the Tylenol murders. The confrontation escalated, and Arnold shot the man, an innocent individual who had nothing to do with the case. The victim, tragically, was killed, and Arnold was arrested for murder. It was a bitter irony. Though Arnold was never proven to be connected to the Tylenol poisonings, the weight of suspicion indirectly led him to take another life. In prison, he faded into obscurity, a sad footnote in a story already drenched in tragedy. And for investigators, Arnold's breakdown was a painful reminder of how far-reaching the psychological ripple of the case had become. Even those merely adjacent to the investigation could be destroyed by it. Meanwhile, James Lewis remained a figure of interest. Though imprisoned for extortion, his name appeared again and again in FBI reports, true crime articles, and whispers among agents. There was something about him: the timing of his letter, his proximity to Chicago at the time, his manipulative personality, that kept suspicion alive. Some investigators were convinced that he wasn't just an opportunist, but the man behind the poisonings. But without physical evidence, the case remained stuck in limbo. And so, for decades, the Tylenol murders sat in the archives, pulled out only occasionally when a journalist revisited the story or when a family member of the victims demanded justice. Then came the 1990s and 2000s, and with them, the revolution of forensic science. DNA profiling had changed the landscape of criminal investigations. Suddenly, cold cases once thought unsolvable were cracking open under the pressure of genetic evidence. Police began to wonder, could DNA finally expose the Tylenol killer? The problem was that the capsules, bottles, and packaging from 1982 had degraded over time. Evidence storage in the 80s hadn't anticipated the forensic breakthroughs of the future. Still, investigators revisited the old evidence, testing it with new methods. They hoped to find even a microscopic clue, a skin cell, a hair follicle, anything that could be matched to a suspect. Results were frustratingly inconclusive. Some DNA was recovered, but not enough to definitively point to anyone. The chain of custody was complicated and the samples too degraded. Once again, the Tylenol case seemed to dangle just out of reach of resolution. But even as science struggled, public fascination with the case only grew. Books were written, documentaries aired, and journalists continued to poke at the mystery. Each new retelling reignited speculation. Was it James Lewis after all? Was it Roger Arnold? Or was it someone who had never even been on the radar? For the families of the victims, these stories were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they kept the case alive, preventing it from being forgotten. On the other, they reopened wounds, reminding them that justice had never been served. And then, in the 2010s, investigators decided to take another shot. Advances in forensic chemistry had made it possible to analyze trace materials in new ways. The FBI quietly reopened parts of the Tylenol investigation, re-examining the evidence with the latest tools. They even went so far as to conduct fresh interviews with James Lewis, hoping to catch him in a slip-up. Lewis, older now, remained as slippery as ever. He denied involvement, sticking to his story that the extortion letter was his only crime. Some agents still believed he was guilty, while others suspected the real killer was long dead, his secret buried with him. Despite decades of effort, the Tylenol murders remain officially unsolved. But their impact is undeniable. The tragedy changed consumer safety forever, leading to tamper-evident seals that are now standard on everything from medicine to food. It reshaped how corporations respond to crises, with Johnson & Johnson's transparency hailed as a model for crisis management. And it cemented a chilling truth. Sometimes, the simplest act, a few poison pills placed on a shelf, can cause a nationwide panic. As the years passed, the case became less about catching the killer and more about the haunting absence of closure. For the victims' families, each anniversary was a reminder of justice denied. For investigators, it was a lesson in humility, the acknowledgement that even with thousands of hours of work, some mysteries remain beyond reach. And for the public, the Tylenol murders stand as one of the most unsettling cold cases in American history. Not because of how complex it was, but because of how terrifyingly simple. To this day, the question lingers: who turned everyday medicine into a weapon? And why did they stop after only 7 victims? Was it fear of being caught? Or was the killer satisfied with proving how fragile our trust and safety truly was? These questions remain unanswered, drifting through the decades like a shadow. And unless new science cracks open the case, the Tylenol killer's identity may forever remain hidden in plain sight. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of our deep dive into the Tylenol murders. We've explored the panic in Chicago, investigation, the suspects, and the tragic ripple effects this case left behind. But the story is far from over. In part 2, we'll look at how this crime changed consumer safety forever, reshaped corporate America, and why, even decades later, the case still sends chills through true crime history. If you found this episode compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next installment. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think James Lewis was the real killer, or was it someone the FBI never caught? Drop your theories in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.